The wind on this world did not howl like the wind on Earth. It screamed, low and long, like something alive that was angry at everything below it. Daniel Reyes lay on his back in the wreckage of his shuttle, staring up at a sky that had 2 moons instead of 1, and he thought, quite calmly, that he was probably going to die here. He did not die, not that day. His survey ship, the kind of small solo craft used to scout unclaimed systems before bigger colony ships arrived, had been caught in an ion storm 3 days earlier. The storm had fried half his instruments and torn away one of his engines. He had crash-landed on a rocky plateau surrounded by jagged mountains, and when the dust settled, he found himself alone on a world that was not on any map he carried. For the first few hours, Daniel did what any trained survey engineer would do. He checked his vitals. He checked his suit. He checked what was left of his ship. The cockpit was crushed beyond repair, but the cargo section had survived mostly intact, and that was where his luck began. Inside the cargo hold, he found a small fusion cell, still humming with power. He found a case of tools, a stack of metal plating meant for repairs, insulation foam, and enough ration packs to last him weeks if he was careful. It was not much, but it was enough to work with, and working with not much was something Daniel had always been good at. He spent the first day just walking the plateau, looking for a place to shelter. The wind was the real enemy here, not the cold, though the cold was bad enough once the twin suns dropped behind the mountains. He found a shallow cave cut into the base of a cliff, barely deeper than a closet, but it broke the wind, and that was what mattered. Over the next 4 days, Daniel turned that shallow cave into something better. He used the metal plating to build a wall across the open side, leaving a small door he could seal at night. He packed the insulation foam into the gaps between the rock and the metal. He wired the fusion cell to a heating coil he built from salvaged components, and by the 5th night, his tiny shelter was actually warm. It was not much to look at. A single room, barely large enough to lie down in, built from scrap and stubbornness. But it kept the wind out, and it kept him alive, and for a stranded engineer with no idea if rescue was coming, that felt like a victory. Daniel did not know he was being watched. High above the plateau, where the mountains grew steep and the air grew thin, there lived a clan of creatures that no human had ever seen before. They were long and scaled, with wings that could carry them for hours without tiring, and eyes that could see for miles in the dark. The people of this world called them dragons, though that was a human word, and no human had been here to use it until now. One of them, a young dragon named Kara, had been the first to notice the strange light. It appeared on the plateau below her family's territory, flickering at night where no light should be. She was young enough to be curious and not yet old enough to know that curiosity could be dangerous. For 3 nights, she watched the light from a distance, perched on a ridge above the plateau, her wings folded tight against the cold. On the 4th night, she saw a shape moving near the light. It walked on 2 legs. It was small, smaller than any dragon, without wings, without scales, without anything she recognized. She did not tell the elders right away. She told herself she wanted to understand more first. That was the excuse she gave herself anyway. The truth was simpler. She was fascinated. Down on the plateau, Daniel had no idea that a set of golden eyes was studying him from the ridge above. He spent his days reinforcing his shelter and rationing his food, and his nights running calculations on how long he could survive before his supplies ran out. He did not have a plan for rescue. His communication array had been destroyed in the crash, and even if it had survived, the storm had likely scrambled any signal for hundreds of miles. So he did what humans have always done when stranded somewhere hostile. He built. He adapted. He made the tiny space he had into the safest space he could. On the 6th morning, as he stepped outside to collect frost for water, Daniel noticed something in the dirt near his shelter that made him stop cold. Tracks, large ones, 3-toed, deep enough that whatever made them was heavy. They circled his shelter twice before heading back toward the mountains. Daniel crouched down and studied the tracks carefully, running a gloved finger along the edge of one print. His engineering mind, trained to notice patterns, immediately caught something important. The tracks did not look like they belonged to a predator stalking prey. They were too careful, too deliberate, walking in a wide loop around his shelter rather than closing in on it. Whatever had left these tracks had been watching him, not hunting him, watching him. Daniel stood up slowly and looked toward the mountains, toward the peaks wrapped in mist and shadow. He was an engineer, not a soldier, and he had no weapons beyond a multi-tool and good sense. But he understood one thing clearly as he stared up at those silent, distant peaks. He was not alone on this world, and whatever shared it with him already knew exactly where he lived. Kara made her decision on a cold afternoon, 3 days after Daniel found the tracks near his shelter. She had spent those 3 days arguing with herself, circling the same question over and over. Should she reveal herself, or should she stay hidden forever, watching from the ridges like a ghost? In the end, curiosity won, the way it usually did with her. Daniel was outside his shelter, tightening a bolt on the heating coil housing, when he heard the sound of wings. He looked up, expecting a bird, and instead saw something the size of a small aircraft gliding down from the ridge above. His whole body went rigid. Every survival instinct told him to run for the shelter and seal the door. He did not run. Instead, he stood very still, set his tool down slowly on a flat rock where it could be seen, and raised both empty hands. It was a gesture that meant nothing to the creature landing in front of him, but it was the only thing Daniel could think to do. Show that his hands were empty. Show that he was not a threat. Kara landed 20 feet away, folding her wings against her body, and stared at him with large golden eyes. Up close, she was even bigger than she had looked from a distance, easily 3 times his height with her wings folded, and covered in scales that shifted color slightly, depending on the light, from deep green to a dark bronze. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Daniel had trained for first contact scenarios back on Earth, in classrooms that always felt too theoretical to matter. Stay calm. Do not make sudden movements. Let the other party set the pace. He had never expected to actually use any of it, and now that he needed it, his heart was pounding so hard he was sure the dragon could hear it. Kara tilted her head, studying him the way a bird studies an unfamiliar insect. Then, slowly, she lowered her head closer to the ground, bringing her eyes level with his. It was not a threatening motion. If anything, it looked almost like she was trying to seem smaller, less frightening. Daniel took that as an invitation. He crouched down slowly, keeping his hands visible, and picked up a small metal disc from his tool kit, one of the spare heat sinks he had salvaged from the wreck. He held it out toward her, not close enough to touch, just close enough to see. Kara's eyes tracked the object with obvious interest. That was how it started. Not with words, because neither of them had a language the other understood, but with small objects held out carefully, with gestures repeated slowly, with patience on both sides. Daniel drew shapes in the dirt with a stick, simple pictures, a sun, a mountain, a small stick figure that was meant to be himself. Kara watched everything with unblinking attention. Over the following days, Kara returned again and again. She began bringing things too, a strange root vegetable that grew high in the mountains, tough and bitter but edible, and once, a chunk of raw meat from an animal Daniel could not identify. He was cautious about eating unfamiliar food, but hunger eventually won over caution, and the root turned out to be surprisingly good once he figured out how to cook it over his heating coil. In exchange, Daniel showed her simple things from his world. He showed her how his tools worked, careful never to demonstrate anything that could be used as a weapon. He showed her drawings of Earth, of oceans and cities and other things she had never imagined existed. She could not understand most of it, but she watched with the same fascination every time. He started to learn a little of her language too, or at least the sounds and gestures dragons used among themselves. It was slow, clumsy work, but it was working. Not everyone in Kara's clan was pleased about her new habit. High in the mountain stronghold where her people lived, an old dragon named Threk had ruled as elder for longer than most of the clan could remember. Threk had survived storms, famines, and worse, and had learned long ago that survival meant caution above all else. When word reached him that Kara had been seen near the strange creature on the plateau, not once, but many times, he summoned her immediately. "You have been visiting the small one," Threk said, his voice low and rough with age. It was not a question. Kara did not deny it. She rarely lied, even when it might have been easier. "He is not dangerous," she said. "He builds. He shares food. He has done nothing to threaten anyone." "You do not know what he is," Threk replied. "You do not know where he came from, or if others like him will follow. You are young, Kara. Young things are drawn to new and shiny things without thinking of the danger. Sitting nearby, listening with obvious disapproval, was a warrior named Van. Van had fought off raiders from rival clans more times than he could count, and he had little patience for what he saw as reckless curiosity. The creature should be driven off, Van said flatly, or killed, before it becomes a problem we cannot control. We do not know what weapons it might have hidden. We do not know if it called others of its kind to this world before it crashed. Threk raised a claw for silence, and Van fell quiet, though his expression made his opinion clear. You will stop visiting it, Threk told Kara. That is my decision. Kara bowed her head, as was expected, and said nothing more. But that night, after the mountain stronghold had gone quiet and most of the clan slept, she spread her wings and flew down to the plateau one more time. Daniel was waiting by the fire he had built outside his shelter, and when he saw her land, he smiled in a way that told her he was glad she had come, even though he did not understand a word of what had happened at the stronghold. She sat with him a while, watching the strange bright fire he had made, and decided that whatever punishment might come later, this had been worth it. Above them, unseen by either, old Threk stood at the edge of the stronghold, watching the two small lights on the plateau below, the fire and the shelter, and made a decision of his own. If Kara would not stay away from the human, then Threk would go and see this creature for himself. The morning Threk arrived, the sky over the plateau was the color of ash, and a light snow had begun to fall for the first time since Daniel had crashed on this world. He was outside checking the seams of his shelter for leaks when a shadow passed over him, far larger than the shadow Kara usually cast. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. The dragon descending toward him was old. That much was obvious even to someone who had never seen a dragon before Kara. His scales were a deep gray, worn and scarred in places, and one of his horns was chipped near the tip. But there was nothing frail about the way he moved, and nothing weak in the eyes that fixed on Daniel the moment his feet touched the ground. Daniel did what he had done with Kara. He set down his tools. He raised his hands. He stood still. Threk did not approach right away. Instead, he circled the shelter slowly, studying the metal walls, the sealed door, the faint heat shimmering off the small chimney vent Daniel had built to let smoke escape. His eyes lingered on every joint, every welded seam, every piece of engineering that should not have existed on this world, not with the tools this world's people had left. You built this, Threk said, though of course Daniel could not understand the words. It was Kara who had followed behind, translating with the small vocabulary of gestures and sounds they had built together over the past weeks. She repeated the meaning as best she could, pointing at the shelter, then at Daniel, then making a building motion with her claws. Daniel nodded and mimed the same building motion back, then pointed at himself. Threk moved closer, and up close. The old dragon was even more intimidating than Kara had been. But Daniel forced himself to stay calm, remembering the same lesson he had used before. Do not run. Do not show fear you cannot control. Let the other side decide the pace. The old dragon lowered his head and studied Daniel's face for a long time, close enough that Daniel could feel warm breath against his skin. Then Threk did something unexpected. He reached into a pouch woven from tough plant fiber that hung from a strap across his chest and pulled out a broken tool, something that looked like a simple hand pump, cracked along one side and clearly no longer working. He set it down in front of Daniel and stepped back, watching. Daniel understood immediately. This was a test. He picked up the broken pump and examined it carefully. It was old, clearly a piece of technology that predated anything the current dragon clans could produce. Made from a lightweight metal alloy Daniel did not recognize, but understood the function of well enough. A crack ran along the housing where it had likely been dropped or struck too hard. Working quickly with the tools he had, Daniel cleaned the crack, applied a bit of sealant from his repair kit, and reinforced the weak point with a thin strip of metal from his own supplies, careful to preserve as much of the original device as he could. It took him nearly an hour, with Threk watching in complete silence the entire time, and Kara watching just as intently beside him. When he finished, Daniel handed the pump back, testing the mechanism first to make sure it worked. It did. Threk took it back slowly, turning it over in his claws, watching the moving parts function smoothly for the first time in what was likely years. Something shifted in the old dragon's expression, though it was subtle enough that only Kara, who knew him well, noticed it clearly. "Where did you learn to do this?" Threk asked, and this time his voice was not hostile, only curious. Through Kara's clumsy translation, Daniel understood enough to answer. He pointed at himself, then made a gesture he had practiced with Kara for the word builder, then pointed toward the sky, trying to convey that he came from somewhere far away, a place where such skills were common. Threk was quiet for a long moment, staring at the repaired pump. Then he spoke words that Kara translated slowly, piece by piece. "My clan once knew such skills," Threk said. "Long before I was born, our people built things far greater than caves and stone walls. There was a collapse, generations ago, a sickness in the land, a failure of the old ways, and much of what we knew was lost. We have lived in the shadow of what we used to be ever since." Daniel listened, understanding perhaps a third of what was actually said, but grasping the sadness in the old dragon's tone well enough. Not everyone shared Threk's newfound curiosity. Van had followed behind at a distance, arriving just as the repaired pump changed hands, and he did not like what he saw. He landed hard, kicking up snow, and stalked forward with his wings still half spread. "Elder, you cannot mean to trust this creature," Van said. "A clever trick with a broken tool does not prove it means us no harm." "No," Threk agreed. "It does not, but it proves something else. It proves this creature has knowledge our clan has not had in generations." Van's jaw tightened, and he turned to Daniel directly, sizing him up the way a warrior sizes up an opponent. "If you wish to prove yourself, human," he said, though again the words needed translating. "Prove it, as a warrior would. Face me." Daniel understood the tone well enough without translation. He glanced at Kara, who looked worried, and then at Threk, who watched with an unreadable expression, clearly curious how Daniel would respond. Daniel had no interest in fighting a creature 4 times his size and clearly built for combat. Instead, he did something that made Van pause. He laughed, not mockingly, but genuinely, and shook his head. Then he pointed at the repaired pump still in Threk's claws, then at his own head, then made a small gesture of scales versus a gesture of thinking. Kara translated the meaning as best she could. He was saying strength was not the only kind of value, that his mind, not his muscle, was what he had to offer. Van did not look convinced, but Threk let out a low sound that might have been amusement. "Clever," the old dragon said, "and wise enough not to accept a fight he cannot win. Perhaps there is more use in this one than muscle after all." Threk straightened, looking between Van, Kara, and Daniel, and made his decision. "The human may stay," he announced. "For now, he will prove his worth to the clan, or he will not. Watch him closely, Van, but do not harm him without cause." Van did not look pleased, but he bowed his head in acceptance of the elder's word, as tradition demanded. Kara, on the other hand, could not hide her relief, and even Daniel, understanding only pieces of what had just happened, could read the outcome clearly enough in their faces. He was not being driven away, not yet, and as the snow continued to fall over the plateau, Daniel allowed himself, for the first time since the crash, to hope that survival here might mean more than just staying alive one day at a time. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the kind of spring that still carried frost in the mornings and only softened into warmth by midday. By the time the last of the heavy snow had melted from the plateau, Daniel's tiny shelter had already begun to change into something else entirely, though he did not fully realize it at the time. He was simply solving problems, the way he always had, one at a time. The first problem he solved was water. The dragons of Threk's clan drank from a stream that ran down from the mountain peaks, but during the coldest months, that stream often froze solid, forcing the clan to melt ice by breathing fire on stone basins, a slow and wasteful process. Daniel, watching this one afternoon while visiting the lower edge of the stronghold with Kara, immediately saw a better way. Using scrap metal from his wrecked shuttle and materials Kara helped him gather from the mountainside, Daniel built a simple filtration and channeling system that redirected a portion of the stream through an insulated pipe, keeping it from freezing even in the coldest weather. It was not complicated, not by human standards, but to the dragons who watched him build it, it looked like magic. Sela, the clan's healer, was among those who came to see the finished system. She was smaller than most of the other dragons, with pale blue scales and careful, thoughtful eyes, and she watched Daniel work with the same intensity a scientist watches an experiment. "You understand how water moves," she said to him through Kara's translation, once the system was running smoothly. "Do you understand how bodies work as well?" It was an odd question, but Daniel nodded, explaining as best he could that where he came from, understanding how things worked, whether it was water or metal or living creatures, was simply part of how his people solved problems. That conversation marked the beginning of a friendship that would prove just as important as the one Daniel shared with Kara. Sela began visiting Daniel's shelter regularly, bringing questions about wounds that would not heal properly, about sicknesses that spread through the clan during the coldest months, about herbs and treatments that seemed to work sometimes and fail other times without any clear reason why. Daniel did not have all the answers. He was an engineer, not a doctor. But he understood basic principles of hygiene, of how infections spread, of why clean water and clean wounds mattered more than most people realized. He shared what he knew, and in return, Sela taught him about the plants and herbs of this world, which ones healed and which ones harmed. Meanwhile, Daniel's shelter kept growing. What had started as a single room built from scrap metal slowly expanded, first with a second room for storing tools and supplies, then with a covered outdoor area where dragons could gather without being fully exposed to the wind. The dragons themselves began helping with the construction, hauling stone and timber that Daniel could never have moved on his own, guided by his instructions on how to build walls that would not collapse and roofs that would not leak. None of them, not even Daniel, fully realized what they were building. They were solving problems, one at a time, the same way Daniel always had. But problems solved one at a time, over weeks and months, had a way of becoming something much larger than anyone intended. Van remained distant through most of this, watching from the edges, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced that any of it mattered. He did not trust easily, and clever tricks with water pipes and healing herbs did not change that. What changed his mind, in the end, was something far more direct. It happened on a clear morning when a group of young dragons, barely more than hatchlings, wandered too far from the stronghold while playing near the lower slopes. A predator native to the mountains, a massive six-legged creature the dragons called a ridge stalker, caught their scent and began stalking them through the rocks. Daniel was nearby, checking on a section of the water pipe, when Kara spotted the danger and let out a warning cry that echoed across the mountainside. Every adult dragon in earshot moved at once, wings spreading, ready to fight. But the young dragons were trapped in a narrow ravine, too far away for anyone to reach in time before the ridge stalker closed the distance. Daniel did not have wings. He did not have claws or fire or any of the weapons dragons carried naturally into a fight. What he had was his mind, and he used it. He grabbed a coil of cable and a set of small explosive charges he had salvaged from his shuttle's emergency systems. Charges meant for clearing debris, not for combat, and sprinted toward the ravine faster than any of the watching dragons expected a creature his size to move. He reached the narrow entrance to the ravine just ahead of the ridge stalker and quickly wired the charges along the rocky walls above the entrance. When the predator lunged forward, Daniel triggered the charges, and a controlled rock slide sealed the ravine entrance completely, trapping the ridge stalker on the wrong side while the young dragons scrambled to safety through a gap on the far end that Daniel had spotted moments earlier and directed them toward. No one died that day, not the young dragons, not Daniel, not even the ridge stalker, which eventually found its own way out through the rocks hours later and retreated back into the mountains. Van arrived just as the dust settled, having flown as fast as his wings could carry him, expecting the worst. Instead, he found the young dragons safe, gathered around Daniel, who was breathing hard but grinning with the particular relief of someone who had just watched a risky plan actually work. Van said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at the sealed ravine entrance, then at Daniel, then at the young dragons who owed their lives to a creature he had wanted to drive away only months earlier. "You did not fight it," Van said finally, through Kara's translation, his tone somewhere between confusion and grudging respect. "You outsmarted it." Daniel shrugged, still catching his breath. "Sometimes that works better," he said, and even without a full translation, Van seemed to understand well enough. From that day forward, Van's hostility began to soften, not all at once, but steadily, the way ice thaws when spring finally arrives for good. He still watched Daniel closely, He still asked hard questions, but he no longer spoke of driving the human away. Word of what happened spread quickly, not just through Threk's clan, but beyond it, carried on the wings of dragons who had relatives in neighboring territories. The story grew a little with each telling, as stories always do, until it reached ears far beyond the mountain stronghold. A small creature without wings or claws, living among the mountain clan, who could outthink predators, heal the sick, and build wonders from scrap and stone. It was not long before the first outsider arrived to see the truth for herself. The first outsider to arrive was not a warrior or a scout, but an elder from a neighboring clan named Ara, an old dragon with dark red scales and a reputation for sharp judgment. She landed on the plateau on a bright afternoon, alone, without escort, which Threk later explained was itself a sign of respect. She had come to see, not to threaten. Daniel was in the middle of teaching a group of younger dragons how to reinforce a stone wall when Ara arrived, and he noticed the way conversation around the settlement quieted the moment she landed. Kara quickly explained who she was, and Daniel set down his tools and approached with the same calm patience he had used with Threk months earlier. Ara said little at first. She simply walked the growing settlement, studying everything: the water system, the reinforced shelters, the storage buildings that now held enough food to see the clan through a harsh winter without fear. She studied the way Daniel worked alongside the dragons, not above them, not below them, simply beside them, solving problems together. By the time she left 2 days later, she had made her own decision, much as Threk once had, though she kept her thoughts to herself for the moment. But she was not the last to come. Within weeks, dragons from 3 other neighboring clans arrived, some out of curiosity, some hoping to trade for the knowledge Daniel carried, and a few, quietly, hoping to learn whether the stories were exaggerated. They were not exaggerated. Daniel found himself busier than he had ever been, and stranger than that, he found himself needed in ways he had never expected. He was not a leader by nature. He had always thought of himself as a problem solver, someone who worked best alone with a wrench and a set of blueprints. But problems, it turned out, did not stop needing solving just because there were more of them. With Threk's support, and with Kara, Sela, and increasingly Van standing beside him, Daniel began organizing what had once been a simple shelter into something with actual structure. He mapped out where new buildings should go to avoid the worst of the mountain winds. He taught the dragons how to store food properly so it would last through the winter without spoiling. He designed simple defensive walls, not for war, but to keep predators like the ridge stalker away from the growing number of hatchlings now living in the settlement. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened without mistakes. A storage building collapsed in a storm before Daniel corrected a flaw in his own design. An early attempt at a defensive wall proved too weak and had to be rebuilt twice. But each mistake taught something, and the settlement grew stronger with every correction. By midsummer, what had once been Daniel's tiny one-room shelter had become the center of a fortified village, with proper buildings, organized paths, and a population that included not just Threk's original clan, but dragons from at least 4 others who had chosen to stay and become part of what was forming. Roles began to emerge naturally, echoing traditions the dragons had once known but largely forgotten during the long generations since their ancient collapse. Some dragons took to building. Others, guided by Sela, focused on healing. Van, unsurprisingly, organized what amounted to a small defense force, though its purpose was protection from predators and disaster, not conquest. Threk watched all of this with an expression that mixed pride and quiet astonishment. "We are becoming something we have not been in a very long time," he told Daniel one evening, as they sat together near the water system Daniel had built so many months earlier. "I did not expect to see it in my lifetime." Not every clan welcomed these changes. Word had reached a distant clan led by an elder named Garath, a proud and territorial dragon who saw the growing settlement not as an opportunity, but as a threat to the old order of independent clans that had existed for generations. Garath believed that a unified group of clans, organized and strengthened by outside knowledge, would inevitably grow powerful enough to dominate every other territory in the mountains, whether that was Daniel's intention or not. Garath sent a warning first, delivered by a small group of his warriors who arrived at the edge of the settlement with wings spread wide and postures clearly meant to intimidate. Their message was simple: stop growing. stop gathering other clans under one banner, or face the consequences. Van, standing at the front of the settlement's small defense force, refused to back down, but he also did not attack, holding his warriors steady despite the provocation. It was Daniel, arriving quickly once he heard what was happening, who offered a different response entirely. He asked, through Kara's now much improved translation, for a chance to speak directly with Garath himself, rather than exchange threats through messengers. The warriors were skeptical, but they carried the request back to their elder. Garath agreed, though not out of goodwill. He was curious, in his own way, just as Threk had once been, to see the creature responsible for so much change with his own eyes. The meeting was set for a week later, at a neutral point between the two territories, and as the day approached, tension settled over the settlement like a held breath. Threk and Van both intended to accompany Daniel, unwilling to let him face Garath alone, and Kara refused to be left behind despite Threk's initial objections. When the day finally arrived, the group traveled together across the mountains, the settlement they left behind continuing its work under Seela's careful oversight. Everyone aware that whatever happened at this meeting would shape what came next, whether that meant continued growth and cooperation, or conflict that could undo everything they had built. Garath was waiting when they arrived, flanked by a dozen warriors, his expression unreadable, his massive dark-scaled form casting a long shadow across the rocky meeting ground. He studied Daniel for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the weight of old suspicion and older pride. "So," Garath said, through Kara's translation, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the small human standing calmly before him. "This is the creature that thinks it can build a kingdom out of dragons." The words hung in the cold mountain air, and every dragon present, friend and stranger alike, waited to see how Daniel would respond. Daniel let the silence sit for a moment before answering, the way he had learned to do over the past year, giving weight to his words instead of rushing to fill the quiet. Garath's warriors watched him closely, wings half spread, ready for any sign of a trick. "I am not building a kingdom," Daniel said, waiting for Kara to translate each phrase carefully. "I am building a shelter. It just happened to grow larger than I expected, because more people needed it than I expected." Garath's eyes narrowed further. A shelter does not gather 4 clans under one roof. A shelter does not organize warriors and healers and builders into something that looks very much like a kingdom preparing for war. "It is not preparing for war," Daniel replied. "It is preparing for winter, for sickness, for predators that do not care which clan a hatchling belongs to before they attack. I have seen how much your people lost when the old knowledge disappeared generations ago. I am only trying to help some of it come back." Threk stepped forward then, his old voice carrying easily across the meeting ground. "I have known you long enough to trust your judgment, Garath, even when we disagree. Come and see the settlement yourself before you decide it is a threat. Judge it with your own eyes, not with fear of what it might become." Garath considered this for a long moment, his tail flicking against the stone ground, clearly torn between old suspicion and the possibility that he was wrong. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "I will come, but if I see anything that confirms my fears, I will not hesitate to act." "That is fair," Daniel said simply, and even Van, standing tense and alert beside him, seemed to relax slightly at the reasonable exchange. The journey back to the settlement took 2 full days, and Garath spent much of it in silence, watching everything, saying little. When they finally arrived, he did not rush to judgment. He walked the paths between buildings slowly, watched dragons from 4 different clans working side by side without conflict, saw hatchlings from different territories playing together as though the old boundaries between clans meant nothing to them. He watched Seela treat an injured builder with methods that combined old dragon knowledge with new techniques Daniel had taught her. He watched the defense force Van had organized, made up of warriors from multiple clans, training together not for conquest, but for the simple purpose of protecting everyone who lived within the growing settlement's walls. By the 3rd day, Garath found Daniel near the original shelter, the small metal and stone room that had started everything, now standing as the heart of a much larger structure that had grown up around it over the past year. "This is not what I expected," Garath admitted, his voice quieter than it had been at their first meeting. "I expected to find fear, control, A creature using clever tricks to make itself ruler over creatures far larger and stronger than itself. I never wanted to rule anyone, Daniel said honestly. I wanted to survive. Then I wanted to help the people who helped me survive. Everything else grew from that, one small decision at a time. Garath studied him for a long moment, then looked out over the settlement, at the water system running clean and unfrozen even in the cold mountain air, at the storage buildings full enough to guarantee no one would go hungry in the coming winter, at the walls that kept predators out without keeping neighboring clans at a distance. Perhaps, Garath said slowly, there is wisdom in what you have built here. Wisdom my pride nearly caused me to attack rather than understand. What followed was not immediate friendship, but something more valuable in the long run, an honest agreement. Garath's clan would not be absorbed into the growing settlement, but they would become allies, sharing knowledge and resources freely, with Garath himself visiting regularly to learn the same lessons Threk's clan had learned months earlier. Other clans, watching how the conflict resolved without bloodshed, grew more willing to approach the settlement not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. Over the following months, the settlement continued to grow, but it grew differently than it had before, guided now by a council made up of representatives from every clan involved, with Threk as its respected elder voice, then overseeing shared defense, Sela leading healing efforts across all territories, and Kara, no longer just a curious young dragon, but a skilled translator and diplomat in her own right, bridging the gap between human and dragon understanding in ways no one else could. Daniel found himself with a title he had never asked for and never quite grew comfortable with. The dragons called him founder, not ruler, a distinction he insisted on repeatedly, though the difference mattered less to the dragons than the respect behind the word. He advised on construction, on organization, on the countless small problems that arose from bringing so many different clans together under one growing settlement. But the decisions, the true decisions about how this new community would govern itself, were made together, by council, by consensus, in a way that echoed both the ancient traditions the dragons were rediscovering and the simple human belief that no one person should hold all the power. On a clear evening nearly 2 years after his crash, Daniel stood at the entrance of his original shelter, now transformed into the great hall at the center of what people had genuinely begun calling a kingdom, though it was a kingdom unlike any that had existed here before, built not through conquest, but through cooperation between two very different kinds of people who had found, against every expectation, that they needed each other. Kara landed beside him, older now, more confident, wings folded easily as she settled at his side to watch the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. "Do you ever miss your home?" she asked, her command of his language far better now than it had been in those early, clumsy days of gestures and drawings in the dirt. Daniel considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I think I found something here I might never have found there. A place where I actually mattered, not because of what I was, but because of what I could give." Below them, torches were being lit along the settlement's main paths as evening settled in, dragons from a dozen different clans moving easily among each other, hatchlings racing between buildings, warriors trading friendly jabs after a long day of training, healers comparing notes near Sela's growing infirmary. It was noisy and messy, and nothing like the quiet, careful order Daniel had once imagined a kingdom should look like. It was better than that. It was alive. As the last light faded behind the peaks, a new banner was raised above the great hall, one that Threk himself had commissioned months earlier, its design blending the sweeping wing shapes of dragon tradition with simple human symbols Daniel had once drawn in the dirt during those first uncertain days of contact. It caught the wind and unfurled fully for the first time, visible from every corner of the settlement below. It was a small thing, really, just cloth and dye and careful stitching. But it marked something much larger than itself. The beginning of an era neither species could have built alone, born from nothing more than a tiny shelter, some scavenged metal, and one stranded human who simply refused to stop solving problems, one at a time, for anyone willing to work beside him.